The morning sun was shy behind the clouds as Clara stepped off the creaky wagon, clutching a small bundle of belongings that weren't worth much more than the rags she wore. Dust coated her torn shoes, their soles nearly flapping apart. She looked around the desolate land that would soon be her new home. The sound of horses and wind filled the silence around her heart, one that had learned to expect disappointment. She hadn't expected kindness, least of all from the man she was told she was marrying. Jacob Turner, the cowboy who stood before her, was as silent as the land itself. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his posture spoke volumes, steady, patient, and oddly gentle. When he noticed her shoes, barely holding together, he didn't look disgusted as others might have. Instead, he spoke quietly, "Then you've brought everything." His tone wasn't mocking, it was warm, like sunlight peeking through a storm. Clara blinked, unsure how to respond to kindness she hadn't earned. They said Jacob was a widower who needed a wife to keep the ranch from falling apart. She was told she'd find shelter and a name under his roof, nothing more. But as she followed him toward the wooden house that stood alone among acres of golden grass, something inside her shifted. There was no judgment in his silence, only a strange peace that made her chest ache. For the first time in years, she wondered if she could belong somewhere. Inside the small ranch house, everything was neat but lived in. The smell of coffee lingered with the faint scent of leather. Jacob poured her a cup and slid it across the table. "You can rest here," he said simply. She wrapped her trembling hands around the cup, letting the warmth soak into her skin. Her eyes fell to his hands, rough, scarred, yet careful as he fixed a loose hinge on the door. She realized this man didn't speak much, but every movement of his carried meaning. When night came, Clara lay awake in the small room he'd given her. The wind whispered outside, and the boards creaked like old memories. She thought of her past, the promises broken, the hands that hurt, the people who said she wasn't worth keeping. Her fingers brushed the old scar near her ankle, a reminder of how far she'd fallen. Yet here, in this quiet house, she felt something new, safety. She wasn't sure how to trust it, but she wanted to. The next morning, Clara found Jacob already outside, working on the corral. The horses moved gracefully under his command, and the rising sun made his figure glow against the horizon. She offered to help, though her body ached from travel. "You don't have to," he said, but she insisted. When she tripped over a loose plank and nearly fell, his hand shot out to catch her. For a brief second, their eyes met, and she saw it again. That quiet, unspoken kindness. Days turned into weeks. Clara learned to cook with him, fix fences, and feed the animals. The ranch that had once looked like an empty wasteland began to feel like home. She smiled more often, though she didn't notice. Jacob did. He'd glance her way sometimes, just to see it. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, he finally spoke, "You don't talk much." She laughed softly. "Neither do you." He smiled faintly. "Then we understand each other." But peace rarely lasts long. One afternoon, as Clara went into town to buy supplies, whispers followed her through the dusty streets. Old memories returned, the ones she had tried to bury. A man she once knew stood by the saloon door, his grin cold and familiar. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he sneered. Clara froze, her hands shaking. Jacob wasn't there. She was alone, facing the ghost of a life she thought she'd escaped. When she returned to the ranch, her eyes were red, and her silence heavier than before. Jacob noticed but didn't press. Instead, he simply said, "Whatever it is, you're safe here." She wanted to believe that, but the shadows of her past whispered otherwise. That night, she sat on the porch, the stars dim above her, and prayed that the peace she had found wouldn't vanish like all the others before. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. Clara tried to hide her trembling hands when she worked, but Jacob saw more than he let on. He'd lived through his own share of storms, and he recognized fear when it lingered. One evening, as the wind howled over the plains, he finally asked, "Who was he?" The question froze her. She hadn't said a word about the man in town, but somehow Jacob already knew. Her throat tightened. "Someone who once owned me," she whispered. At least, he thought he did. Jacob didn't speak. Instead, he walked to the fire, grabbed another log, and set it down gently. The silence between them was no longer cold, it was understanding. "He won't come here," Jacob said finally, voice steady as stone. But Clara wasn't so sure. Men like that didn't forget. The thought haunted her long after Jacob went to bed. She sat by the window, clutching the blanket, praying the past would not follow her here. Her prayer was short-lived. 2 nights later, the sound of hooves echoed outside. Jacob reached for his rifle before she could breathe. A shadow moved near the barn, a voice calling her name, twisted with mockery. Clara, you run off and marry a ranch hand. Jacob's jaw clenched. When the man stepped into the moonlight, his grin faded at the sight of the cowboy's rifle aimed straight at him. You need to leave, Jacob said calmly, but his eyes burned. She's not yours. The intruder laughed. You think she's worth defending? She's nothing but, he didn't finish. Jacob's voice cut him off, low and sharp. Say one more word, and you'll find out how wrong you are. For a long moment, only the wind spoke. Then the man spat on the ground and turned his horse, riding off into the dark. Clara's knees gave out as relief and fear tangled in her chest. Jacob caught her before she fell. He's gone, he whispered. He won't touch you again. After that night, something changed between them. Clara saw not just a protector, but a man who saw her worth even when she didn't. She started to laugh again, small at first, like a bird learning to sing after the storm. Jacob never asked her to forget her past, he just built a life around her healing. Together they planted new seeds, mended fences, and watched calves stumble to their feet each spring. Slowly, the ranch began to mirror their hearts, scarred, but growing stronger every day. Months later, the townsfolk who once whispered now greeted her with kindness. Clara had earned their respect not by wealth or name, but by the way she stood beside Jacob, steady and unashamed. At the next harvest festival, she wore a new dress Jacob had secretly bought her, and for the first time, a real pair of shoes. They fit perfectly, she told him with a grin. He smiled back, eyes warm with pride. You still kept the old ones, he noticed. She nodded softly. They remind me where I started. That night, as they danced under lanterns and laughter, Clara looked up at the man who had once looked down at her torn shoes and seen worth instead of pity. She realized what he meant that day. She had brought everything that mattered: courage, heart, and the will to stand again. The music faded into the sound of the wind through the wheat, and Jacob leaned close to whisper, You've brought everything, Clara. Everything I ever needed. She smiled through her tears, knowing this time, she wasn't dreaming. She had found her home, not in the walls of the ranch, but in the steady love of the man who never tried to fix her. Scars only held them gently. And as the stars glowed over the endless prairie, Clara finally believed the words she had waited her whole life to hear: she was enough.